I realized that like maritime is a huge part of society. 80, 90% of the world's trade is done along the oceans, and it's kind of like fundamental. And it's also a hard to abate sector. So it's not easy to decarbonize. And so that
Mm.
becomes a nice juicy challenge to kind of go, how do I help?
Hello and welcome to Green Shift, where we try to make sense of sustainability. I'm David Austin, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Victor Nian, founding co-chair of the Center for Strategic Energy and Resources. And today we're joined by Riccardo Barbiellini, a maritime and energy transition specialist with Bureau Veritas's Future Shipping team. Riccardo works at the intersection of shipping, regulation, and decarbonization, helping one of the world's most essential and hardest to abate industries navigate the shift to a low-carbon future. Before we dive in, a few quick terms that will come up in this conversation. You'll hear Riccardo talk about TUAS. That's Singapore's next-generation megaport, designed to be one of the most advanced and automated in the world. TEU stands for 20-foot equivalent unit, basically the standard measure for shipping containers. We also mention fuels like HFO, MGO, and VLSFO. These are traditional marine fuels, ranging from heavy fuel oil to cleaner, low-sulfur alternatives. You'll also hear LNG, or liquefied natural gas, which is currently the most widely adopted lower carbon alternative fuel. And LNGC stands for liquefied natural gas carriers, ships specifically designed to transport LNG. The IMO, or International Maritime Organization, is the global body that sets the rules for international shipping. And we discuss MEPC 83, a key recent meeting of the IMO's Marine Environment Protection Committee, where major climate decisions like NZF or NZF, which refers to the proposed net zero framework for shipping emissions, were discussed. With that context in mind, let's get into the conversation. Could you start by sort of painting us a picture of what does a sustainable ASEAN port city look like in, let's say, 2040? What fuels are ships using? What kind of energy powers the docks? Love to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah, thank you, David. So yeah, a nice tricky question off the bat.
Mhm.
2040, sort of 14 years away. And as you say, given current situations, things may change. What I normally like to do when I'm forecasting is I like to backcast. So let me look 14 years back and where were we 14 years ago, and then kind of go, what was the trajectory, and then kind of interpolate into the future. So 14 years ago, so early 2012, things were, say, more paper-based, much simpler. So what has changed? More automation, increased technologies, not at a breakneck speed in maritime, so in the ports, etc., but they have improved. So then if I go into the future, sort of 2040, I think that change will continue. So I think we'll see more use of automation, so artificial intelligence, etc. So that will become a larger part of the world. I also think there's a large change in terms of use of renewable and sustainable energy sources. So I would expect to see increased use of, say, solar panels, wind turbines, and other energy sources like that. Not only would they bypass any potential carbon taxes, but they also make a port and the port city more resilient. So there's less reliance upon external energy sources. So I think that's a big part of it. But the biggest bit, I think, is you probably see these ports will be bigger. Like when I talk about Singapore, because I live in Singapore and I work in Singapore, moving to TUAS, they're looking at 3 to 4 times, TEU output, so the amount of containers that they shift per year, with half the people, but you've got more trade. So you're talking a much bigger port, much more work going on. Obviously trying to reduce the energy usage, increase the automation. And they're also wanting to make sure that they are like a gas station or a petrol station for cars. When you roll up, you've got your leaded fuel, your unleaded fuel, your 90, 95, your 98, your diesel, your compressed gas. So you're now going to have that, I think, ports, say, come 2040, where all these different alternative fuels are starting to come into play. And so I think when you roll up to a port, you'll have all these fuels that are on offer, and then it's up to the user to decide, based on their carbon emissions for the year, which fuel they want to choose, and therefore what they need to do. I don't think by 2040 we'll be fully off HFO, MGO, VLSFO. I think it's too soon. I think 2050 even is maybe a little bit too soon to be completely off the carbon fuels. But I think use will be less, and we'll start seeing the other alternative fuels being more and more and more. So broadly, that's where I'm seeing sort of 2040 where things may be.
Well, I think it makes perfect sense. But I think what I will add to the spice of it is really we're all hoping the IMO is going to take the leadership. But then if you look at really what happened just a couple of months ago, it was a huge disappointment. But then again, I kind of think that this maritime decarbonization sustainability development is the way to go, whether we like it or not. If it's not decarbonization, then there's the energy security, then there's the alternative fuel, right?
Yep.
War can just broke up like this. Sustainability is not just about decarbonization. It's also about future-proofing ports, future-proofing shipping, whether that alternative fuel pathway is the future that we should consider should go. But then again, Rick's point, vessel going bigger, ports going bigger, right? So then do you have the scale for that supply? And that's also the other side of the questions. So I think it's still a positive future we can still expect. It's just how we could really make it happen.
Just one thing I want to pick on a little bit is, the idea that you'd have all these different fuels on offer. Does that match, though, the kind of investments that would have to be made? Or, do you think ports would be willing to have all these, or would they see it as more viable to pick one or two winners and just focus on that?
It's a very good question, and it does touch on what Victor was talking about in terms of supply and demand and affecting the marketplaces for the alternative fuels. To make any of them viable, you do need enough supply and enough demand to then create the marketplace. I suspect we will see regional uses of specific fuels. Maybe ammonia will be used in some parts of the world, methanol in other parts of the world, because that is where it makes sense in that space. For someone like Singapore, where it's kind of a global hub, it might be a challenge for them because they might be expected to offer all the different fuel types. So you might start to see these strategic ports where they can do everything and they become the hub. And so then the global maritime logistics network becomes much more almost like a spoken hub kind of concept with these big strategic ports so that it can do anything. And then as you go regional, you start to decrease fuel options. It's smaller and smaller.
And that would also be in line with Singapore's overall kind of value proposition to be that sort of strategic hub for every industry. They want to be the hub in the wheel.
I mean, we are bunkering 20% of the global ships. So, if anything has to happen, it has to happen here. But then again, the question is scale, right? Too large a scale, not so easy to handle. Too small a scale, it probably won't make any sense to make any investment. So then where's the sweet spot, right?
Yeah, spot on.
Hey, Riccardo, I'd like to change the focus to you yourself a bit here now, because you've had a really interesting career. You started in aviation, I believe, and now you're in energy transition in the shipping industry. What inspired your move into the maritime sustainability field, and how do your earlier roles in defense and gas networks shape your work today?
Yeah, interesting. So it was not premeditated, let's say that. So the opportunity popped up, and then I decided to take it. So in aviation, we have a very similar regulatory framework to maritime, but the risk profile in aviation is a lot higher. So there's a lot more safety involved in the aviation space. But that kind of prepared me for regulatory side of maritime. And then in the energy part of my work, I was doing more sort of project management, program management, and then innovation portfolio management. And then I was an asset strategy manager for a gas distribution company in the late sort of 20-teens. And it was at that time that the decarbonisation kind of zeitgeist came into society, and we were really looking at hydrogen and biogas and alternatives for your methane within your gas pipes. And I think that for me struck a personal chord, like a nice value resonance, where what I do adds value to more than just my bank account. It actually adds value to the world. It makes the world a better place for my kids, my grandkids, etc. I had some friends who presented the opportunity for me to come into the maritime industry. And then now that I'm here, I realize that maritime is a huge part of society. 80-90% of the world's trade is done along the oceans, and it's kind of like fundamental. And it's also a hard to abate sector. So it's not easy to decarbonize. And so that becomes a nice juicy challenge to kind of go, how do I help? Such a fundamental part of society, like it still needs to be here in 2040, 2050. But we really don't want to be a dirty industry. So how do we cross that gap?
And now you're with BV, Bureau Veritas, right? And
Correct.
So how does BV's future shipping team support maritime players through the energy transition? And whether it's on the technical advice or regulatory insight.
Correct. Yeah. So if any listeners don't know, so BV is a class society. So we do technical seaworthiness certification for ships who sail in international waters, and we represent flag, so nations, to register effectively their ships to make sure that they are seaworthy. So that's a safety and quality check. In normal speak, that means we are inspectors and surveyors who walk on ships and look at ships and make sure they are designed properly, built properly, and operated properly. So we're in 140 countries around the world. We have over 12,000 ships on our registry. So we're a big class society. So what that then gives us is visibility of what's happening, not just on a couple of ships, but a lot of ships and a lot of ships around the world. And so it gives us a lot of in-depth technical understanding. Obviously, at the same time, we are heavily involved in IMO and regulations, standards, etc. So we understand what's needed from a regulatory perspective. So it puts us into an interesting niche place where we're an independent third party. So we're not directly involved in any capital and any finance, the operational output of the vessel per se. But we are experts on the ship, and we are experts in the regulations, which is a future uncertainty. And so then the future shipping team was created to help bring that expertise to the operators who are facing this uncertain future in terms of, I need to do something to decarbonize. It doesn't make a lot of financial sense. There's a lot of regulation being put down on me. What do I do? Like, what do I need to think about? And how do I answer that question as an operator? And so that's what the future shipping team is here for. So we are technical experts, regulatory experts, maritime experts to kind of come in and go, cool, what's your problem set? Like, what are you thinking about? Let us help provide some advisory, help you make your decisions.
Since you have that technical expertise and you, as you say, walk the ships and you kind of know every nook and cranny of it, let me ask you something that just came up when Victor and I were talking about in another forum, is the safety aspect of, let's say, ammonia as a fuel for ships. Yes. What do you think about that? Because safety was like the number one issue that everyone was talking about. How do you see that safety environment for ammonia?
It's a good question. And it's very, very toxic. It's sort of 55 times more toxic than methane or something. So if you have a leak, it kills everything in the water. It has issues. So there's a couple of things that this brings up. Something that's probably not spoken about a lot is the social license to operate. So if you do have an incident and you end up killing an entire ecosystem, will people want you to use ammonia as a fuel? So that's one aspect. So I'll put that to the side. From a safety perspective, a lot of these are technical engineering problems. And I'm an engineer, and engineers are very good at solving technical problems. And so I suspect that they'll be able to figure out how to use ammonia safely. The question, though, is it a pragmatic solution? Is it cost effective? Is it actually usable? Can sailors operate a vessel, in an efficient, effective way? And that's the bit I'm not sure on. So I do know at the moment, when I talk to the engine manufacturers, the big issue with ammonia is the joints and the valves and the escaping of the ammonia at those points, because you have an engine that's vibrating, and so you've got a flange, and that's where it leaks. And they're really struggling to come over that problem. I'm confident that they'll figure it out, but does that make the engine 10 times more expensive than it needs to be? What is the consequence of that solution? So that's where I think the uncertainty lies with ammonia.
That's where the other debate comes in. The engineers could fix the problems, but let's hope that they're not creating another problem by fixing one.
Exactly. Yeah.
But then again, if you look at the non-engineering side, you look at the regulatory side, that thing gets really interesting, right? I mean, by definition, ammonia is a toxic fuel. And by the IMO regulations, toxic fuel, not for marine, not for the marine environment, not for shipping. So now the question is, are we really opening this up? So if you do, then what it takes to open up that regulation? If let's say we allow ammonia on the ocean, does that mean we're allowing any other toxic fuel to be used? If somehow we can protect them. I mean, nuclear being another option, right? It's not being talked about a lot. It's also toxic from a radiological point of view, right? So, and if you say ammonia kills people, well, it gets exposed to radiation, it also kills you, to be fair. And that was also something that we discussed, right? Is ammonia a fuel for the future, or at least an option for the future, or is it just another distraction? I think that's where the questions was asked.
Yeah, and there's also potential of like LNG. It's a cargo and a fuel. So LNG carriers will use the cargo as a fuel. So maybe you've got ammonia carriers. Can they use ammonia as a fuel as well? So there's that aspect as well. But yeah, very valid points, Victor. Like, and everyone's trying to figure that out now, right?
Before I move on, I mean, should we talk about the IMO a little bit, since it's already come up and it seems to be a linchpin in all this? And, from your perspective, Rick, how have you seen the changes in the IMO, and, what's happening and what can we expect in the near term?
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, so the MEPC 83, roughly 6 months ago, where they decided not to proceed with, or they push forward the NZF. So it's an interesting one, and it depends who you talk to. So when I talk to, say, European people in Europe, nation states, etc., they're all very positive. They're like, yes, all the working groups are still doing what they're doing. They're still working towards the NZF. Yes, the framework will have some minor modifications, but it's just a delay. It's fine. Then go talk to the nations in the Pacific, and they're all like, we need more. The NZF was good, but we are starting to drown as countries. We need more on the NZF. So they're actually pushing the other way. You then talk to, say, Middle East and, say, USA, and they're like, yeah, no, we're never going to approve the NZF. This has moved from a let's say an IMO standard technical safety discussion. This has moved into a political realm where you're talking employment, GDP, you're talking much more what's good for me as a country. And that's kind of out of the scope of IMO. 6 months on, I haven't really seen any clarity in terms of what's going to happen to the next MEPC. Everyone just seems to be doing what they were doing before. So it's causing uncertainty in a lot of the industry. I've definitely, in the last 6 months, seen less investment and less interest in sustainability and decarbonisation, because everyone's going, okay, we now have this political risk, this uncertainty that's coming ahead. I'm not going to potentially burn my money. So I'm going to just stop. I'm going to wait. I'm going to talk to people like me and kind of see what happens next, which is pragmatic and it makes complete sense, but it doesn't help with actually moving the industry forward.
Where do you see investment right now? Anything? Is there anything that's moving ahead?
LNG is where there's a bit of investment. So we're seeing a lot of LNG carriers being ordered on the order books. That's basically because LNG is the only real viable alternative. It has the lowest, carbon emissions, equivalent compared to HFO, etc. So a lot of people are moving in that space. Artificial intelligence and just digitalization in general. We are now seeing a lot more people. Normally the bigger boys, to be honest, the larger ship owners, dabble in AI. Otherwise, people are starting to hesitate. Those are the two main areas that I see investment at the moment. And there's a lot of, continuing on work as it is, sort of a little more R&D in the R&D space.
Well, that brings me to this next question, this sort of broader general question, but it's about the energy transition and sort of the question of whether top-down regulatory action comes first or bottom-up private sector push should lead.
So my personal opinion is top-down. The reason, unsurprisingly, comes from a technical perspective, moving into the economic space. For me, the reason we use HFO, MGO, etc., is that it's the most practical fuel source out there. It's very energy dense. It's relatively available, which makes it cheap. We had hydrogen being used back in the 1920s. There were some safety issues there. We had electric cars, back in the 1900s. They just didn't last as long. And so the industry then moved to the pragmatic solution, which was, petrol, diesel, HFO. And so we've had 100 years to optimize HFO. So then you're now talking about a ship that needs to sail a long way, carry a lot of, a bit of fuel, but it makes money by carrying cargo. So this is what makes it hard to abate, is that how do you wean yourself off the most energy dense energy source that you've got to something that's more expensive, that's going to take up more space, therefore reduce my cargo, reduce my fuel, reduce my range. It doesn't make any operational sense to switch fuel. So if you're asking the maritime industry to do a bottom-up solution, it's never going to happen. In my opinion, it's never going to happen because it makes no sense. You're asking businesses to lose money. And it's like, what pragmatic business makes that decision? Very few, in my experience.
Right.
So then what's left? Top down. So you need regulation. You need the agencies with the authority who think about the greater good, not just the business bottom line, to create the legislation, the regulation to say you will change the way you operate like this, or else we will charge you a carbon tax or something. So we'll make it worth your while to change how you operate. So I think for hard to abate sectors especially, you do need a top-down regulatory enforced system to then change your modus operandum. And then once that's going and you've got the marketplace, the carbon marketplace and all that set up, then you can start to loosen a little bit and let the industry, come up with how they optimize it in that realm. And then they can come up with bottom-up solutions in that space. So in my opinion, it's top-down, which is why the IMO, the NZF, I think is encouraging, because I think it's movement in the correct space by the correct people. And I think the trend is we're moving that way. So it will come. I think maritime is going the right direction. Never as quick as people like me want, but you're talking about very expensive assets that last a long time. So we also need to be realistic about, the pace of change. So it's coming and it's going the right way.
And that does sort of bring it back out to the political realm as well, as you were saying. So not something you can solve quickly or easily. But Victor, that also echoes a lot of what you've talked about previously about you have to look at what we're moving away from, not just what we're moving to. You talk about how the whole economies that we're living in right now were built on fossil fuels.
No, actually, that's always been my point. Where are we going away from, right? And first of all, what's wrong with fossil fuel? I mean, okay, yes, there's greenhouse gas emission, there's pollution, there's blah, blah, blah. But then again, without fossil fuel, you have no ships running across the ocean. That's the bottom line, right? You want international trade? Well, what's powering the aviations, what's powering ships, what's powering trucks? Fossil fuel, right? You don't have any other fuel at that scale, at that price, that allows us to have goods deliveries at really, really a reasonable price. I mean, you want to ship something across the ocean, even if you use an air freighter, the price is reasonable. I mean, for the speed you get. I mean, if you're not in a rush, you want to ship via sea, 2 weeks later, half a month later, you get it, but this really is really affordable. Think about how that's going to be replaced overnight. With ammonia, okay, your shipping fee is going to be double, triple, maybe 10 times. Would you pay for that? And then if somehow there's a few disruptions, sorry, your ship is going to be docked at the port for another 2 months. And plus clearance, you're going to receive your Christmas goods by next Christmas. Do you really want that? So all that reality starts to kick in once we start talking about fossil fuel phase out. So then the question is, from an economic standpoint, do we accept that? And then from a social point of view, is the consumer willing to pay for that premium? We always say, decarbonization comes as a premium, and especially shipping is a hard to abate sector. Do we pay or should we pay? If you're not paying for that premium, then money has to come from somewhere. Whether, top down from a regulation, from policy, from incentives, from whatever, money has to come from somewhere. And the somewhere is us, individual consumers, right? So I think we still have to ask that question, whether that transition is justified. I mean, if you look at just energy transition, right? It's the alternative fuel pathways, whichever fuel we're talking about, either ammonia, methanol, nuclear, even electrification. Is that really a just transition path that we are looking at for the maritime industry? And to some extent, I don't blame the ship owners for not adopting alternative fuel, because that's the risk, right? If you become expensive and others are not doing it, well, you lose business. It's simple as that. Whereas to countries, if you start to impose regulations, well, you get expensive. I mean, especially if you think about Singapore or any open economy, and like Singapore, if you put a unilateral tax or anything and there's no reciprocation from any other countries, well, you're simply making yourself more expensive. Do you really want that? So then it's not really just the environmental questions that needs to be asked. There's a whole lot of other questions: economics, social, governance, right? Who produce what? Sustainable marine fuel, right? What does it mean by sustainable? That's actually our collaboration with the BV, right? What qualifies as sustainable marine fuel? So I think all that question needs to be answered.
We're obviously not going to answer it right now, but maybe let's talk about a little bit more of the micro level. We had some discussion here about like Singapore's approach of awarding MPA grants for ammonia pilots. And what does that mean for the country and the region at large from a policy perspective? Let's talk about kind of what's going on right now and how you see that as either helping or, or if it's not going to gain any traction. What's your opinion?
I think it will help. I think what it shows is intent, which is important for a country. Is, they are wanting to do alternative fuels. They're wanting to invest. They're wanting to provide an environment where shipping companies who are looking at alternative fuels can operate in. And I think that's very important when you're talking about the amount of capital that needs to be spent in this space. So when I was working in New Zealand, the Labour Party made a very snap decision to stop oil and gas exploration come 2018. And that was done without any discussion with the industry. The result of that was OMV, so a very large oil and gas company, sold everything and left the country because they said, if I have this political instability, I have this risk with my capital that I don't accept, and so I'm going to sell and move on. We're seeing with this MPA fund is intent going, you can put your capital here, try your trial with ammonia fueling and bunkering here. And so then if you ever want to use it, come to Singapore. We can help you operate with ammonia. So that's what I'm seeing from a political perspective. Technically, also very useful because you are trialing this. And so there's a lot of learnings that we need to do. Like, what are the safety standards we're following? What's the process that we're following? How do I handle this? What's my safety distance? What kind of pipe do I need? What kind of valve do I need? Like, you're starting to test all of those equations and calculations that your safety engineers have done. And as we all know, you can do as many text-based assessments as you want, but until you do it in reality, you're not going to understand how to do it. And so you need a sandbox to physically trial the fuel, which is what Singapore is offering. Is a sandbox trial of ammonia, somewhere safe, controlled environment. Let's learn how to do this together for the world. That's a valuable thing to do as well. And then the final bit I would suggest is the market layer, as Victor was saying, is you are showing demand. Like, we would like to start to use ammonia as a fuel. So then that signals suppliers to go, okay. So, it might only be 80,000 tons per month, but it's something. It's not zero. Therefore, that investment into my ammonia plant, all right, let me start thinking about how do I bunker out of my ammonia plant to ships, not just selling to trucks. So it's a small step where you start developing a market for this kind of fuel. So, I mean, the ammonia that's in the news, the ammonia they're looking in for Singapore, I think it's coming from India. And so you're now talking about a bunkering ship coming from Japan. And so it's like, okay, multiple countries, multiple assets, all having to coordinate. So it's not easy, but unless you do it, it's never going to happen. So, yeah.
Is there anything else going on that signals intent, either in Singapore or any other ports or jurisdictions around Asia that you can tell us about?
So the order book is an interesting one. So in the shipping maritime space, as you know, when you order a ship today, you sign the contract, it takes 2 years before the ship is built. So you can look at the order book of the shipyards, you understand kind of where you're looking. So LNGCs is a big one, but then also methanol. So the amount of methanol ready and dual fuel ships that exist is definitely increasing on the order books. There seems to be an increased interest in methanol. The bit with methanol is I'm not quite sure where it's coming from. I'm hearing lots of discussions about where it's coming from. Being methanol ready, I think, is being seen as a pragmatic place to be for ship owners. And then the final one is really operational efficiencies. You can look at alternative fuels and going low carbon in that space. Or I can look at how do I reduce the amount of carbon I emit by doing what I do today, using the fuel that I have today. So that can be as simple as optimizing the kind of containers that you have. They use less energy to run the reefer containers, like the cooling systems on a container. Ones that use less energy, fantastic. I now need less fuel to go from A to B. To wind sails, to air lubrication systems, to hull optimization, to you name it. There's a swath of energy saving devices that are being trialed at the moment, because you obviously have a lot of existing ships who are facing a potential future of a carbon tax of some sort. And they're like, how do I reduce my cost of compliance? Like, how do I, get around that? The answer is ESDs and biofuels at the moment. So,
and ESD stands for?
Sorry, energy saving devices.
Energy saving devices. Interesting. And you mentioned biofuels. You want to talk about biofuels a little bit? Tell us what's the state of that, and we'll get into the minutia a little bit.
In this part of the world, it's definitely picking up. So a lot of the biodiesel that we see is POMI, so the palm oil, and there's a lot of palm oil plantations in Malaysia, Indonesia. So we are definitely seeing a lot of suppliers popping up looking to provide biodiesel two users. And the beauty with the biodiesel is it's pretty much plug and play. Like given what you've got, you can just put biodiesel in. It's not exactly right, but you can effectively just chuck it in and you're good to go. So it's very attractive to existing ship owners to using the biodiesel. There's also the bio-LNG space, so looking at biogas. There's the implicit demand there. Therefore, we're starting to see an increase of supply. So we're starting to see the biofuel marketplace growing. The challenge with bio is how do you ensure quality? Like, how do I know that the liter of biofuel is selling me is actually biofuel from a poney source? And so that level of traceability and sort of assurance is where a bit of the questions are at the moment. The other big issue is also reporting of carbon emissions, because you have big fuel tanks, and if you start mixing bio with non-bio, what are you burning? What do I report? So that the mass balancing problem effectively. So it becomes complicated quite quickly. And the final bit is just there are currently a lot of players in that supply chain of current fuel, and they're all profitable. And you're starting to suggest a different supply chain and more rigor needed. And so there's hesitation there to then adopt it full throttle. So technically there might be a solution, but kind of like commercially, we're still working our way through it. But I do see biofuel as coming to the market relatively soon because it is plug and play and there's not much else really needed. So it's quite promising, but there's still a bit more of stuff to work through.
In this instance you're describing, is the biofuel coming, the palm oil source, is that like basically virgin palm oil, or is it any kind of waste or used cooking oil or anything like that?
So it's not HVO, it's not waste cooking oil. So it's actually a palm tree that they squeeze and they get the oil out of it, which can be used like diesel.
And is this like, are they planting new plantations for this, or are they shifting food production to biodiesel production, or do you have any visibility on that?
And I think they're taking it away from food. That's more of an ethanol discussion, and we can discuss ethanol if you want. But the bio stuff, we are seeing plantations being planted now looking at biofuel as the output of that place. Ethanol is an interesting fuel because that comes from your corn, your soybean, your crop that is human food. It's very big in Brazil and USA.
Right.
And you are correct in asking about that potential conflict of fuel versus food. I don't think that's been fully thought through in terms of, like what's that conflict? How much is a kilo of corn for fuel going to cost versus a kilo of corn for humans? And is there a potential conflict there? But ethanol can be used as a fuel. And so BV has done a technical study on that, and it can be used as a transition step, if you will, towards methanol, because a lot of the componentry is very, very similar. One of the potential challenges with ethanol is that it can be drunk by humans, and it makes them very, very, very drunk. So you will have 50,000 liters of moonshine on a ship. And how do you stop your crew from drinking your fuel? So that's you got to be careful of that.
That's like going back to the old days of sailing, right? Trying to keep your sailors.
Wow. A pint of rum every day and off you go. Yeah. Interesting stuff.
Well, we've already talked about a lot of really interesting stuff. I don't want to get into too much more topics just because I don't want this to go on for hours and hours.
Yeah, you're saying that we shouldn't be adding any more topics, but I just want to add one more topic. It's always my topic. I think, Rick, you already know what I want to talk about. We should talk about nuclear shipping just a little bit.
We should. Yes.
Some people think it's a fancy dream, but you got Chinese building a vessel with a molten salt reactor. You got icebreakers running around, the real icebreakers. You got military vessels, nuclear subs, nuclear aircraft carriers. It's been around for ages. So the question is, are we really seeing commercial nuclear merchant ships? Now, notwithstanding the UK has already allowed nuclear merchant ship to register with the UK flag. Do you see that as a potential future?
Yes, I definitely do. Don't like the phrase silver bullet, because I sometimes think people think of a revolutionary step, and therefore I don't need to do anything because a silver bullet is coming and I'll just go to nuclear in the future. And it kind of avoids the evolutionary step, which I think still needs to happen. But for me, nuclear is genuinely zero carbon. Like there's no carbon anywhere in this discussion. And so if you want to go to a zero carbon fuel, nuclear makes sense. I don't need to refuel my ship every trip. It's 10 years between refueling. The size needed for a nuclear engine is really small. We've been using nuclear engines for decades, well over 50 years. Like we understand the basic Gen 1, PWR, Gen 2 kind of nuclear systems. We understand how they work. They're relatively safe. They're safe systems. They work really well. Yes, your engineers need to understand how it works. So they need to be well trained. And yes, they are a bit expensive, which I think is why they haven't been uptaken in a lot of the commercial space. You are correct. Icebreakers, there's 8 icebreakers, I believe, in the world that use PWR, nuclear reactors. And they're used because diesel freezes, negative whatever, and therefore you can't use traditional fuels. Therefore, what have you got? You've got nuclear. Nuclear works up in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So it's actually, in a way, a very pragmatic solution. SMR takes it one step further, where you're going, okay, it's small, it's modular, so let's start reducing costs. Molten salt says, okay, fantastic. I have thermal runaway. I'm now not going to go explode. I'm actually going to cool down. I'm going to stop the system completely. Makes it even more safe. So there is a lot of interest in nuclear in maritime. They're still really waiting on the SMR to get cracked and become more commercially viable, because that will make it cheaper, effectively, therefore make the whole vessel with an SMR more financially attractive. The other aspect is also regulatory and insurance, if I could say. The MSC, so the Maritime Safety Committee under the IMO, is bringing nuclear back onto the table. So they had a meeting in January about this. And they're talking to the IAEA, and there's the Atlas program under the IAEA to start joining the IAEA and the IMO to kind of start sorting out what the regulatory structure is for, nuclear on vessels commercially. And so we're starting to see standards being thought about in this space from a regulatory perspective. So it's coming, I think. The other aspect is insurance. So you've got the Brussels Convention and the Vienna Convention, which are from the 60s. And so they're a little bit out of date. Not every country has ratified them. But you can imagine, like, as a country, you're saying, okay, dear nuclear reactor ship, come into my port. Heaven forbid something bad happens. Who pays that bill? And that's not very clear. And so that's one of the barriers where we're like, okay, what's the insurance cap and how does that insurance system work for a nuclear powered vessel? So BV's written a report recently, and to give you a broad answer, so 2040 is the rough date where we think that you'll start getting IMO regulation updated, IAEA will be aligned, your conventions will be updated. You'll start doing your first proper trials with SMR come 2035-ish. Where Standard says around 2040, you should have commercially viable SMR vessel designs ready to be built, just in time for your 2050 net zero IMO target. And then hopefully, you start seeing nuclear vessels becoming more and more common in the world. So it's definitely attractive. Yeah.
I mean, we're definitely curious to read that report, if you can share, because I think that would really help us, or rather help anyone to have access to the report with a broader kind of view about what is really up and coming. And I think people need to know this. I like the way you frame it. Nuclear is not the silver bullet, but probably without this option, there's not going to be net zero nuclear shipping. I mean, not net zero shipping for the future. So I think it's important that we do get this message across to the industry, to the society, that don't rule out nuclear. They're been around us. They've been around us for many, many years. And we should enjoy the benefit rather than making them exclusively military.
Yeah, that social license to operate is an interesting one, right? Because Europe has been using them for decades, and we've had a couple of incidents, obviously, so the Fukushimas, the Chernobyls of the world, but we've gone a long way since the Gen 1, Gen 2 PWR gen plant. So it's the changing that mindset of the public to accept it. And I think there's a real need to kind of change the narrative around nuclear. We need to start saying, like, it's tied to energy security, it's tied to national security, it's tied to your energy prices, like how much you're going to pay for your electricity, and start giving real, like, facts-based, information to the general public to go, this is a viable solution. It's, commercially, it's very good. It works. It's here. Why are we not using this? So work is needed in that space, but I don't see any reason why we can't do it. Yeah, and we haven't even spoken about floating nuclear power plants or transportable nuclear power plants. which are big in this part of the world. When you have nations that are full of islands, and it's very hard to build submarine cables or energy generation plants on every single island, it's becoming quite attractive. We're having discussions with Indonesia, the Philippines. There's always rumors in Singapore around nuclear power plants, and sticking them on the water. Actually, there's quite a few benefits for having as a floating nuclear power plant. And so there's a lot of work in the floating nuclear power plant space. And some of the benefits, to spell it out, safety. So you're not on land. So your exclusion zone is fine because it's out there in the ocean. So if something goes bad, it doesn't affect your neighborhood. Cooling, there's water there. So you need water sometimes. Yeah. And there's some really interesting ideas of using floating nuclear plants to generate hydrogen, to generate fuels, and you stick them in the middle of the ocean and have them as floating petrol stations effectively. So there's a lot of good work going on in the TNPP, FNPP space.
Well, thank you so much. You really shared a lot of your experience. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, guys. That was good. That was good fun.
Thanks.